I don't know if this shows up fully on camera, but as you can tell by the necklace that I'm wearing in terms of the keyblade that comes from the Kingdom Hearts series, this is going to be a Final Fantasy themed video. Is this the spoiler-ish review of Final Fantasy 16? Not quite yet. I have not uploaded that to the channel quite yet because I'm still in the flux of editing all the clips that I have filmed for that respective review, and it's going to be quite a lengthy one, so it's taking me a little bit of time. But this particular video is Final Fantasy themed. I'm really excited about it, so let's just go ahead and dive in. Hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as TA Summers. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a combination of Final Fantasy related material as well as bookish material. So yes, this is my own personal creation in terms of a book tag. This is the Final Fantasy Legacy tag, which I've decided to do as a part of my channel to kind of blend two of my favorite things, the Final Fantasy franchise, as well as my love for books. So the Final Fantasy Legacy tag is one that I wanted to create to celebrate the fact that this franchise is 36 years old, and to focus on the celebrating the legacy it has for many with many people through storytelling, through character, through engagement in the media as a gaming medium, as well as a wider perspective medium as well. By and large, Final Fantasy isn't a series that lands pitch perfect in everything that it does. It really depends on your preference in terms of your exposure to the series, but in the moments that it does, it's absolutely phenomenal and wonderful. And I'm glad to have followed the series as long as I have in terms of things, and I look forward to seeing what's to come of it in the future. I wanted to create a book tag that does a combination of showcasing my love, as I said, for the series as well as the stories they tell, and link it to another means of storytelling that I love, which is, of course, books. And it kind of makes sense in terms of how these two go hand in hand. I'm kind of surprised that more people on YouTube and even in BookTube who may be gaming fans haven't done as much in terms of being able to combine these two elements in terms of things, because Final Fantasy does very wonderfully, like in terms of the storytelling department, and you can say that it kind of unfolds in kind of this combination of lore, character, world building, things like that for each game in the franchise, and its own unique contribution in terms of the collective series as a whole. And this isn't to say that the Final Fantasy franchise is limited to games. It also has books written about it, whether you have stuff archiving the history, sometimes talking about the artwork and the art books. Sometimes it's the inspirations behind the series have been chronicled in books as well. And you also have books about the individual games that exist in terms of things. Audio dramas are also a thing, especially in Japan as well. So you can say that there's an intertwining between the gaming community as well as the storytelling community in terms of the impact that Final Fantasy has had overarching. There are also manga and anime adaptations of Final Fantasy as well in terms of things, and you may hear me talk about this on the channel in future videos for my level of exposure to those different mediums in terms of the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. And there are also movies. Of course, there are movies like in the Final Fantasy franchise that I may also review on the channel at some point in terms of things of various reactions that I've had to it in terms of things as well. And I have seen a number of them coming from whether it's Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, the Final Fantasy movie, as well as Kingsglaive, which is related to Final Fantasy 15. So I've seen those movies. I will, in some capacity, revisit some of them and review them on the channel when I have the opportunity to do so. It's really hard to deny the impact that this franchise has had a whole over the years, looking at the different mediums that it's represented in terms of things. But by and large, like it has had an immense impact in terms of the gaming community as a whole in terms of things, and I'm glad to be able to do a tag that kind of like goes between both two mediums that I love and being able to combine them. So with respect to the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole, it's a much bigger legacy than I have the opportunity to be able to go into in the scope of this video. So I'm not going to try. I know that this is going to be kind of a long video in terms of giving both the questions that I have created for this tag as well as the answers for this tag. And I may talk about each of the questions with respect to a theme that I relate to these. But like in terms of like talking about the overarching stories in the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole, I don't have a whole bunch of time to be able to do that in the scope of this video. But I am going to try to kind of touch on some points as I'm asking each of these questions. This is meant to be a tag for everyone to do for as long as you want or as brief as you want. So as I ask these questions, like you can expand on them as much as you want to in terms of your response video. I'm not going to do any direct tags for this video for the most part, but I think this is going to be a tag that anybody can do, and you can either do the Final Fantasy related questions or the bookish related questions. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as you're going through this video, and also just looking at the different prompts and things like that. But like I said, if you did a 2-hour video responding to this respective tag, I would watch every minute of it if it meant that you had the space to be able to talk about something you love or feel passionate about, and why. I kind of want to know why y'all like stuff. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I love doing these bookish tags and these bookish video tags. Originally, I wanted to do 16 individual questions for this tag to represent the mainline titles of the franchise, not counting sequels like Final Fantasy X-2 or Final Fantasy XIII-2, or offshoots like Final Fantasy Tactics, Type 0, or Stranger of Paradise, which is one of the latest Final Fantasy games to come out for the PS5, which I have not played, but I'm planning on doing so. And I am planning on doing a review of that for the channel as well at some point. But I realize if I'm going to do a dual tag, especially in terms of framing it where I'm asking one Final Fantasy related question as well as a bookish question, it would easily blossom into 32 questions, and that's a little bit much for the scope of this video. So what I decided to do instead is kind of pair up two Final Fantasy games within the theme within a common theme of a question, and limit it to that, so that I have two games that are paired in each of these questions together. Considering like it takes the 16 mainline titles, combines them into two, that's eight individual Final Fantasy questions combined with a question about books. And so that gives us the 16 questions that I'm going to ask in this respective video as a whole. And you can do either one of these. As I mentioned, you can either do just the Final Fantasy theme question or the bookish related question. For the sake of this video, I'm going to actually answer both questions, so it's going to be a little bit long, but you can do this at your leisure, whatever you want with. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into it. One other brief note, since I grouped the individual games into pairs for the scope of each theme to each question, these are not necessarily going to be in numerical order. I tried to get them as close to numerical order as possible with respect to how each theme of the respective question, but just know that I'm going to kind of do a little brief summary of why I group these particular games together, what the theme of the question is, and then asking the question and answering them respectively. So that's basically how this tag video is going to go. Question number 1, Final Fantasy I and III, the beginning of the journey. Final Fantasy, the original game, was published in Japan all the way back in December of 1987. If you want a really nice montage of the history of Square Enix and how Final Fantasy came to be, I'd recommend watching the complete history of Final Fantasy as presented by the channel Final Fantasy Union. I followed them for quite some time. And I definitely encourage you to subscribe to them if you're interested, because they do such a great job of describing different aspects of the Final Fantasy series, including the history of the games, reviews, interviews, and lore dives. I've watched their videos for quite some time, and I always appreciate their insight into things with relation to the games. So one of the reasons why I group Final Fantasy 1 and 3 together is for the first question is because they're similar in mechanics. You're following four warriors that you can customize to undertake an epic journey. Final Fantasy's main character representation is usually shown through the Warrior of Light, as you can see from this picture here, who has had different adaptations over the years. Final Fantasy 3 really doesn't have a main character in comparison, but the representation that it's had over, especially in the Cydia franchise, and as well as other games, has been the Onion Knight, which you can see here. So this represents the start of the journey of this franchise. So this is why I asked these first initial questions. So Final Fantasy related question is, what was the first Final Fantasy game you played, completed, and or heard about? I'm leaving this question open-ended because sometimes the first game you played or completed or heard about can be different. So I'm going to answer all of those. But other times it can be the same, so I want to know what it was for you. And then there's the book-related question, which is, what was one of the primary books, fantasy or not, that had an influence on your reading interest? It does not have to be the first book you ever read or even the first book in the genre that you picked up, but it can be that if you wish it to be. So to answer both of these questions, first, what was the first Final Fantasy game you played, completed, and or heard about? So I would say the very first Final Fantasy that I played and completed was the original Final Fantasy VII. I originally did not have a PlayStation console, and I actually played a demo for it on PC. So, kind of a story about this that I wanted to talk about from my previous Final Fantasy video was that my first experience with playing a Final Fantasy game was, as I said, on PC. It was the demo was bundled with a group of educational software in terms of things, and they were trying to encourage like kids to or kids and teens to kind of like both play the games as well as do the educational software. And I think it was math related, but it included two demo discs, one of which was Final Fantasy VII, and it had you going through the um, I think it was the Mount Nibelheim, if I remember correctly. I'm not 100% sure on that in terms of things, but I remember it was a CD disc, and it also came with another demo disc of Tomb Raider. So you can say that those two demo discs encouraged me to get an original a PlayStation console to be able to play those games in full in terms of things. And I remember like I tried to convince my parents in terms of things. I was like, "This is a game that I really want to play," and they were like, "Oh, you're really interested into this?" So, like we'll see what happens in terms of like getting this game for you in terms of Christmas, and we'll see what happens. And then Christmas morning, I was able to get both the console, a number of different games, and that also included Tomb Raider and Final Fantasy VII. And I was so happy to be able to be exposed to those games. So yeah, I think Final Fantasy VII was also the first Final Fantasy game that I heard about, and it set the stage for me to follow the game series for the long haul. And I believe I started playing it when I was around 12 years old. For the book related question to this, what was one of the primary books, fantasy or not, that had an influence on your reading interest? I could name several books for this particular question, but I'll go with Justice and Her Brothers by Virginia Hamilton. And you can see the cover up here for your reference. That book, as well as the respective Justice trilogy, which consists of Dustland and The Gathering, subsequently stayed with me for a number of different reasons. It had a black girl who was centered as a protagonist in a fantasy book series. It has Justice coming into her powers with telekinesis. It featured Justice's twin brothers, Levi and Thomas. And as I mentioned before, that was significant for me because I am also a twin myself. Um, I was really fascinated by this overarching story as a whole, considering it explores the relationship between Justice's powers her relationship with her brothers, and ultimately an even more surreal experience with time traveling to the future and the experiences that Justice has in that respective journey. So it blew me away when I first picked it up. I was probably around maybe 11 or 12 years old when I first picked up Justice and Her Brothers for the first time, and then totally picked up the rest of the series as I was able to find it at my library. But I knew from this particular series, the Justice Trilogy, that I wanted to explore more sci fi and fantasy titles among other series that I picked up. Question number 2: Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy IV, trying something new. The reason I group these games together is because they mark a departure from where the first and the third game landed for the Final Fantasy franchise. Instead of having a general group of 4 characters of variant classes that you create in the games who set off to save the kingdom for various reasons, you have several specific characters you're following as part of a larger epic story. With respect to many places, these games go into some very mature, darker themes in terms of the overarching franchise. With respect to Final Fantasy II, Firion is the main character, and I want to note that I have not played Final Fantasy II. This is one of the Final Fantasies that I have not had the opportunity to play, but I do want to at some point. I can't tell you much more about him other than what I've seen in terms of his story with respect to the Dissidia franchise, and beyond general descriptions of the story without going into spoilers. And what little I've seen from Final Fantasy II, it makes me yearn for a more modern adaptation of that respective story. Final Fantasy IV's main protagonist is Cecil Harvey, though there are a lot of compelling characters in Final Fantasy IV. It's been a number of years since I played this, so it's due a replay for me. So that kind of centers the focus on this respective question in terms of trying something new and grouping these games together for the second question. So the Final Fantasy related question for question number 2 is, what retro Final Fantasy game would you like to see an updated version of, and why? And then the bookish question for this one is, what's a book or series that you've read that was published anytime since 1987 in honor of Final Fantasy's overall creation that you'd like to see more attention for? Bonus points for the book related question if it's a fantasy title since 1987. So the first one, in terms of my answer for the Final Fantasy question, I'm going to stick to my original comment in this and say that I would love a full version remake of Final Fantasy II, because I would love to be able to see Furion and the other cast of characters in this game get the same treatment as some of the latter stories in the Final Fantasy franchise, such as Final Fantasy VII Remake, such as Final Fantasy XV, as well as 16, in terms of the upgraded graphics, mechanics, and things like that. I know of Furion, as I mentioned, from the Dissidia games, but I don't know much about Final Fantasy II because it originally didn't get released in the US until much later and on consoles, and it was on consoles that unfortunately I did not have at the time to be able to play it. And it is also frequently confused for what is actually now known stateside as Final Fantasy IV, which I have actually played and enjoyed. The Japanese and US releases were different up to a certain point, so that's the reason why they were conflated with each other. But I'm happy that Final Fantasy II has been re-released in the Pixel remaster of this respective gaming franchise, so I definitely plan on playing it since I own it. And as for the book-related question, what's a book or series that you've read that was published anytime since 1987 in honor of Final Fantasy's creation that you'd like to see more attention for? Chose a paranormal fantasy YA title that I read a while back that I thought was well done, and of course it's about twins. This particular book was originally written in 1988 by Bartha Clemens and her son Christopher Grimes, which is called Double Trouble, and you can see the cover of this for your reference. It's had a couple of cover versions. I will give you the original cover posted here, as well as the cover version that I read and remember for this up here. So this particular story is the story of fraternal twins Philip and Faith, who were separated after the tragic deaths of their parents and older sibling in an accident. And they remain close, though, as the twins have a special ability to sense the other and write letters to each other while they're in foster care. And they have different experiences that are chronicled in this respective story. Faith's ability is mind reading, and Philip can be in two places at once with his ability to have astral projection. And both of them have to call upon their abilities in order to deal with some very tough situations that they face that are chronicled throughout the story without going into too many spoilers. I thought that this was a very quick read. It doesn't get a lot of attention, unfortunately, because of how long ago it was written, but I thought it was a compelling and solid read for what it offered. Question number 3. Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI, the cruelest villain. And there's definitely a reason why I grouped these particular games together, not just because of the numerical order, but because of the iconic villains that they have for each of these respective games. So in Final Fantasy V, the main character is Bart, as you can see here for your reference. And in the case of Final Fantasy VI, we have a mainline heroine that we follow with Tara Branford, who is one of the strongest female protagonists that I've played in a Final Fantasy game that I absolutely love, and it's also my personal favorite as well. But as I mentioned before, the villains for these respective games were downright dastardly if you have played them in terms of things and experienced the stories for yourself. I've played both of these, and while I was a late arrival to playing Final Fantasy VI, it's become one of my top 3 games in the Final Fantasy series, if not number 1. And for the villain for Final Fantasy V, we have Exdeath. Exdeath, to kind of briefly summarize him, he was definitely something. He managed to use a character to do his bidding, and when that plan fell through, he managed to start wiping whole kingdoms from existence and create a rift in the world which our heroes have to contend with. It's very boss, terrifying, but boss in terms of things. And then with Final Fantasy VI, we have Kefka, as you can see in this image here, which if y'all have not played this game, y'all probably don't know how cruel Kefka actually is in terms of things. He is legitimately terrifying despite his lighthearted appearance in terms of things. He looks absolutely clownish, but don't let that fool you. He is dastardly and evil, and it's like, oh my gosh. But he's, like I said, he's more than just a cartoonish looking villain, which like a lot of people say that he has similarities to the Joker from the Batman series in terms of how cruel he is and his mannerisms and sense of humor. But I would argue in some ways Kefka might actually be worse than the Joker in terms of some of the things that he does. But he has a macabre sense of humor on the surface. He has a childlike demeanor, but he's downright diabolical. He will take delight in torturing you before killing you and destroying entire cities just because he feels like it on a whim. So, and not only that, his temper can go for 180 on a dime in terms of things. Like he can be lighthearted one moment, laughing and stuff like that, and then just get cruel and evil in terms of things. But yeah, he's a compelling character to watch. Both Exdeath and Kefka are both compelling villains to watch in the Final Fantasy series. And you could argue that across the Final Fantasy series, like they do a masterclass job of introducing all their respective villains, even multiple villains within the same game. So that prompts this particular question, these particular questions in mind with respect to both the Final Fantasy related question as well as the bookish question. So for the Final Fantasy question for this, name a favorite villain or anti-hero in the Final Fantasy series from any game that you have. And then for a book related question, name a favorite villain or anti-hero in a book you've read and why did you like them? So to answer the Final Fantasy question first, naming a favorite villain or anti-hero in a sprawling series of games like Final Fantasy is a tough sell. I get this because I'm the one coming up with the question, so I know how hard it is. And having played most of the Final Fantasy games, I definitely understand how hard this is. But I would say my favorite anti-hero would probably be Beatrix from Final Fantasy IX. And Beatrix is a great example of an anti-hero. She serves under the rule of Queen Braun, and is tasked with the duty of retrieving Princess Garnet after the princess flees Alexandria in the game. And Beatrix does a lot of horrible stuff in the respective game if you follow its respective storyline. But I'm not going to get into it because of spoilers. But the way she ends up doing an about face and working to help Garnet, Zidane, and the others was well worth seeing unfold in the spectrum of the game's events. And I could name so many more reasons, but we can leave it at that. And even more characters than that, but I'm going to leave my answer at that. And then for a villain from a book, which is the book related question, name a favorite villain or anti hero in a book you've read and why did you like them? I would say for a villain in a book, I will stick to saying Mr. Dark or the Illustrated Man from Something This Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. So he is definitely a villain that stuck with me over the years, considering how compelling he comes across, both in the book version as well as the movie version. I've talked about this on my channel before in terms of one of my all-time favorite reads. His compelling nature is a ruse because his presence is definitely a be careful what you wish for presence, as Jim and Will, the main characters of Something with This Way Comes, figure out. And he's inspired some of the villains that I write in my fiction to this day. And so I couldn't go without mentioning him in one of these kinds of lists. Question number 4. Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X, shock and awe. There's a very good reason why I grouped these particular games together, and you might be surprised why I decided to do this, which is timely for the topic. Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X both have a number of revelations that turn out to be shocking in the sequence of the game's events, often with tragic consequences in the lives of the main people we follow in these games. For Final Fantasy VII, the main protagonist we follow is Cloud Strife, as you can see from the picture here. He has layered levels of trauma with being an ex-soldier and being in pursuit of the main villain in the series, Sephiroth. But Cloud's identity and history are even more complicated when you realize there are things about Cloud's backstory that don't add up. And furthermore, we are far more complicated than they seem on the surface, without going into too many spoilers. And if you've played the game, you already know. For Final Fantasy X, we followed Titus, or Titus. I'm going to say Titus because that's how I've known him longer, but even so. He is a rising Blitz all-star in his hometown of Zanarkand, but lives in the complicated shadow of his father, Jet. And all of that changes when Sin, a terrible monster, attacks Zanarkand and sends Titus 1,000 years into the future into the land of Spira. Titus joins forces with Luna and a number of characters to find out whether he can get home and put an end to their common enemy, Sin. But the journey that Yuna and Titus take are more intertwined than they realize and have much heavier context than what they seem on the surface. Without going into spoilers, if you played the game, you already know, and that's kind of as concise of a summary as I can give for those two games in the spectrum of this video. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask the Final Fantasy related question as well as the bookish question. So for the Final Fantasy question first, what's a scene from a Final Fantasy game, significant or minor, that shocked or shook you so much that you still find yourself thinking about it? Maybe for this particular answer, for this, try to avoid spoilers if you can, or mark them distinctly if you're going to go into them for respect of the discussion you have for this. But if you do want to talk spoilers, like I said, make sure you mark them. That's totally fine. Now for the book-related question, what novel or series have you read that shocked or shook you so much that you still find yourself thinking about it long after you read it? And bonus points if it's fantasy. So I'm going to give you my answers for both of these. So for the Final Fantasy question, what's a scene from a Final Fantasy game, significant or minor, that shocked or shook you so much that you still find yourself thinking about it? I'm not, for the sake of this respective video going to go into any character deaths that happen within the Final Fantasy franchise, because I realize that many people haven't played some of those games. Some of you have, some of you haven't. But I will say that there is one character death in Final Fantasy VII that if you play Final Fantasy VII, you already know who I'm talking about in terms of things. You know the one, and it's exactly the one that you're thinking of without going into spoilers about it. But I'm going to say do something differently. Instead of doing a character death, I'm going to mention a scene. In Final Fantasy XVI, which is the latest installation in the franchise, and I talk about this in my spoiler review, there are many moments where you have story beats that I like to call quiet before the storm moments. And what I mean by that is in these, the characters go from one rough situation, have a little bit of a breather, like the eye of a hurricane when the calm hits and you think things might be safe, but then another wave of the storm comes and the situation goes from bad to worse. So that's what I mean by the eye of the storm when it comes to kind of like a story perspective. So there are many moments in Final Fantasy XVI that I would say that I love and have that quiet before the storm tonality to them. But I'm going to mention one in terms of this that is a smaller scene that stayed with me. And to kind of give context to this particular scene, and I may insert a clip in terms of playing this for this answer. Gav, Torval, and Clive all enter a city that's overrun with Kashyyyk enemies. They legit fight almost every resident in the town that's turned in this respective scene, and they get to a point where they finally finished fighting all the fighters and have a breather and everything else. And after one moment, when you think the bad stuff is over, they're tired, and Torval gets on edge, and then Clive calls to Gav, and clearly there's something wrong, but you don't see what the terrible thing is in terms of things. And Gav turns, and you don't see what they all see, but when the enemy finally shows up, it's like, ooh, I understand their reaction totally and completely. It was very well sequenced and sets up the conflict for that part of the game so well, and it stayed with me. Even after I finished playing the game, that scene just stayed in my head for a number of reasons, and you can kind of see it from the clip that I play here. But
Gav? Don't tell me there's more of the bastards. Oh,
I was very much shaking right along with the characters at that point in the story, without going to too many spoilers. For the book-related answer to this particular question being, what novel or series that you read that shocked or shook you so much that you still find yourself thinking about it long after you read it? Bonus points if it's fantasy. I can name a lot of individual stories and series that shook me over the years that I read. I am going to go with We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, which the whole book, I'm not kidding, the whole book is one of my all-time favorite stories. Question number 5. Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy XIII, character crush. So there aren't really obvious links between these particular games story-wise, but I'm going to draw a few parallels for the sake of grouping them together and posing the respective questions that I asked for this particular section. The first similarity is that they have a main character who seems cold and aloof, but they're skilled to boot with their respective blades and talents. In Final Fantasy VIII, we follow Squall Lionheart as he attends Balamb Garden in preparation for and becoming a member of SEED, elite mercenaries of which are tasked with traveling the world to keep peace between the living spaces called gardens and other locales. But that peace is threatened to be upended, starting with the threatening sources named Adia, and then shifting gears into a much greater threat that wishes to upend the balance of time. In Final Fantasy XIII, the cold and aloof protagonist is named Lightning, and who is a person who caught her own path as an ex-soldier who seeks to save her younger sister Sarah in a race against time. Time is also a hefty element between these two games, so that's a similarity in them and why I chose to group them together. Lightning prefers to do things alone, but ends up traveling along with a group of various characters. In Cocoon, as several threats pop up that endanger the group's home, she, also like Squall in Final Fantasy VIII, wields a gunblade. And as you can see, I can have Squall's gunblade as represented in Kingdom Hearts. I'm hanging on my neck. He's one of my favorite characters. So, of course, I was going to wear this for this video. So, also note another similarity between Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy XIII. Both games also take place in a modern tech world with magic elements at play, alongside summoning spirits that the characters use to fight with. The games also have love stories that are central to each of the games, but are different in representation and tone. In Final Fantasy VIII, we watch Squall develop feelings for Rinoa, a mysterious girl who ends up becoming a member of their party after Seed helps her in one of their missions. Squall technically meets her before that point in an iconic dance scene, and you know the one if you have played that game. But Rinoa's role is far greater than Squall's, and the other Seed members believe, with magic and time being central pieces to this. And Squall wants to stop at nothing to help Rinoa, and because of his love for her. Now, for Final Fantasy XIII, the love story here is focused between Snow and Sarah, who is Snow's fiance. Sarah is also Lightning's sister, so Lightning has an investment to save Sarah alongside Snow. Snow, like Lightning, is desperate to help Sarah avoid a cruel fate and undertakes journeying with the others to save her, while also becoming intertwined with several crises underway in Cocoon. So that's a summary of both of those games, which lend me to my respective questions that are forthcoming. Considering these very epically styled love stories, though they are not the only love stories to be found in the Final Fantasy franchise, I'm going to ask these questions. Final Fantasy question first. Have you ever had a past or present crush on a character from the Final Fantasy franchise? If so, who and why? I will not pass judgment on you whatsoever for answering this question. If not, if that the first part of this question does not apply, what's a love story from the Final Fantasy franchise that you enjoyed watching unfold? And then for the book-related question, do you have a crush on any character from a book or series? Who and why? Or if you don't have a crush on any character, what's a romantic story that you enjoyed reading in a book or series? Bonus points for fantasy or fantasy romance. So those are the two questions, and I'm going to proceed to answer them next. So answering the Final Fantasy question for this respective section, I mentioned in one of my previous videos that my first two crushes came from Final Fantasy VIII. Squall Lionheart is the first I'll name because he's been one of my absolute favorites from the beginning. He's a bit on the cold side to start out, but the character growth he undergoes in this game is great to watch overall, and I love the growth in his character and the just being able to follow him in his respective journey for that particular game. He's a great tactician. He has an epic weapon, gunblade, and he being easy on the eyes definitely helps him in terms of things. And let me not go further than that for the sake of this question, because I could use a whole video to talk about how much I really love and respect Squall. My second crush, who a lot of people may not know if they have not played this game, or just a character that really just doesn't get enough love, I feel like, from this particular game, is Kairos Siegel from Final Fantasy VIII. I adore Kairos so much. Unfortunately, Kairos did not have a lot of scene time compared to Squall and some of the other characters in the game. I always appreciated following him whenever we fought Laguna's part of the story for that game. He had the right blend of very sassy wit and level-headedness that drew me to his character as his character was on screen. But he's also just very good looking. I mean, he's just a very good looking guy. Wish that we had more time with his character in terms of things. I think that's all I can really say about Kairos. I really do wish that we've had more time with Kairos, like in Final Fantasy VIII, or even to see him in more spin-off games and things like that, to be able chronicle his journeys with Laguna and Ward as you're following their part of the story in Final Fantasy VIII. Some other characters that I could think of that were past crushes for me. Balthier from Final Fantasy XII. I mentioned him before in terms of things. You can see a pattern here. I like really witty characters and charming characters in terms of things, and Balthier is definitely witty and just very charming to watch in Final Fantasy XII. So do I have any, you may ask, these are my past crushes in terms of things, and I could still say that I'm very fond of them now, but you may ask, in terms of the more modern games for Final Fantasy, do I have any current crushes? Well, let me point to these two. I will present them without comment in terms of things. I would not be taking questions at this time. Let's leave that for another video. In terms of a favorite love story that I enjoyed watching overall in a Final Fantasy game, just as a bonus to this particular question, I would say that Yuna and Titus still probably take it in terms of their respective love story within Final Fantasy X, since it was very compelling to watch in terms of the first game. And I definitely played Final Fantasy X to be able to see a resolution in terms of things, wanting that 100% mark, and getting to see those final scenes in Final Fantasy X was absolutely worth it to me. And I know that if you've played the game and you've seen that cutscene, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I have not played Final Fantasy X or X-2 in quite some time since I first initially played those, but I definitely want to replay them and give my thoughts about them in a future video. So for the second question to this, for book related question, do you have a crush on any character from a book or series? Who and why? Or if you don't have a crush on any character, what's a romantic story you enjoy reading in a book series? So for current book crushes, I could name some. I have a lot. It's probably worth its own video in time in terms of things, and I may do that for a potential video idea in the future. But I'll say some of my favorites include Hardy Cates from Blue-Eyed Devil by Lisa Kleypas. It's one that I remember having for quite some time. It's been a number of years since I read it, and I want to reread it and give my thoughts about it on the channel at some point. But it's also one of my favorite Lisa Kleypas books as well. Raj Sen from Rebel Heart by Nalini Singh. I absolutely adore that book. This is the cover for it, and I definitely recommend it. And then I would also say Ellis Boyd from Prior Affair by Christina C. Jones. Apparently, I'm finding I'm having a thing for fictional firemen in terms of things. That's all I'll say about that. We'll leave that where it is. Question number 6. Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy XII. Everyone but the hero. So you can probably tell if you've played either one of those games what this particular group of questions is going to be about, but I'm going to expand on it for those who may not have played those games in terms of things. So I grouped these particular games on purpose, and it may be a little unfair because the main characters of these particular titles often get the short end of the stick when it comes to reflection. I personally think Zidane Tribal or Zidane, I'm probably going to just say Zidane, like, just to make it easier. For Final Fantasy IX, is a compelling character, particularly when it comes to the revelations that happen with respect to his character throughout the story. But if you look at Zidane compared to other Final Fantasy heroes, he's definitely the odd one in the bunch. He's carefree, he's humor, he's a little bit of a flirt, probably more accurate to call him a skirt chaser prior to meeting Garnet or Princess Garnet, or Dagger as she's called in nickname for the game. But he does genuinely care for his friends and will help anyone in need. For Final Fantasy XII, the purported protagonist of this game is listed as Vaughn, and you can see his picture here for your reference. But the complaint that people have about him is that he seems to be the only character in the game without a compelling backstory in the sequence of events in the game. He's really just along for the ride. He wants to fly his own airship. That's really how much you get out of him in terms of certain things that where you're starting from the story and going on to the conclusion of the game. I hear very little people saying that their favorite character from Final Fantasy XII was Vaughn, usually I'll hear people say Balthier, who is a sky pirate, and I adore him, as I mentioned before. Fran, who is also a sky pirate, who is a distant from her homeland, and as I mentioned before, I adore her as well. And Ash, a princess who has lost her kingdom, or Bosch, who is a disgraced knight looking for redemption. So those are some of the characters that are from Final Fantasy XII. But people cite Penelo, Vaughn's little sister, who gets more attention through the story progression, considering the things that happened to her in the spectrum of the story. But very few people that I know actually like cite Vaughn as a favorite character among the other characters that are in Final Fantasy XII in terms of things. I do think that Vaughn gets more dimension with his representation in the Dissidia franchise. But I don't and personally speaking, I don't have any problems with him at all. I like him as a character, but when you compare him to some of the other characters in that game, you kind of understand in terms of things why he's not mentioned as much, even though he is the main character. And he's just not the character that, as I mentioned, that I think of as being a favorite compared to so many other mainline or even side characters in the same game. So, with that in mind, in terms of giving the description of both of these games, here are the questions for this respective one, starting with the Final Fantasy related question. What character from the Final Fantasy franchise do you feel deserves a bit more love or attention? And if you were to create a game centering them, what would it look like? And then for the book related question, who is a character from a book or series that you feel deserves more love or attention? If you were to create a story centering them, what would it look like? So the first answer to the first question, the Final Fantasy question, is what character from the Final Fantasy franchise do you feel deserves a bit more love and attention? If you were to create a game centering them, what would it look like? So my answer for that is, I think in general, the answer to this question is going to range depending on what your familiarity with each game in the series is. For me, I could name a few characters here, but I'll stick to just one. And I mentioned him before. Kairos from Final Fantasy VIII really doesn't get a lot of scene time, as I mentioned before. And I find that unfortunate because he really is a cool character. Ward is a cool character as well in terms of things, but of course, for obvious reasons, I mentioned Kairos before in my previous question. But to say the least, probably a game with Kairos as one of the main characters would focus on his background a little bit more. And I think how he came to meet Laguna and Ward in terms of joining their respective party and things like that. And then being able to chronicle some of their adventures together and that kind of thing. Because I really wanted to know more in terms of the flashbacks where we're exploring Laguna's character and Kairos' character and Ward's characters as they're interacting and journey on as their respective roles in the Galbadian army. I felt like I really wanted to know more about Kairos, like in terms of like his background and where he came from and how he met Laguna, in terms of also like what role he ended up playing later on in Final Fantasy VIII in terms of when we see him after the flashbacks in terms of things. So I definitely felt like his character could have used more attention and more love. And I would love to have like kind of a modern game to kind of follow with the same kind of graphical details Final Fantasy VII Remake, being able to follow their characters, because that would be fun to be able to see. And then for the book related question for this sixth pairing, I want to say that who's a character from a book or series that you feel deserves more love and attention? If you were to create a story centering them, what would it look like? So this is going to be kind of an unpopular answer, I feel like, because a lot of people love this particular book, but I felt like the main character of this particular book, I feel like it took a lot of the scene time in terms of things, but I was actually fascinated with one of the secondary characters. So I think for this, I'm going to go with Cassia from Naomi Novik's Uprooted, and I can put the cover up for your reference. Cassia You know, as I said, I don't think this is going to be a popular opinion, but I'm going to say it anyway. I really was fascinated by Kassia's character in Uprooted, and I really wanted to see more of her in terms of things because I felt like she had like a very compelling journey with respect to her role in Uprooted, and I would have loved to see even her be more of a main character. Her relationship with the main character Agnieszka was very one of the things that I really loved about Uprooted, and I wanted to see more of her side of the story along with her viewpoint of her friendship and her respective journey within that book in terms of things. So I guess that would be what I would see a story with Cassia look like from Uprooted to be able to see more of her character. Question number 7. Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV. Music makes the world go round. So I literally cannot tell you much about these games because I haven't really played much of them because they are in the Final Fantasy franchise. They are the multiplayer online games, and unfortunately, I have played a little bit of multiplayer online games, but it's not my cup of tea in terms of gaming. I know a lot of people who do love them, but it's not usually my go-to when I play games in that perspective. So I would say what I can tell you about these two games, both Final Fantasy 11 and 14, is that they have epic soundtracks, and I have listened to both the soundtracks for these respective games, and I've adored them in terms of things, even with not my limited amount of knowledge about those respective games. I did want to give another go for Final Fantasy 14 eventually because my first experience with that game wasn't really a full one, and I've heard from many people that it's worth doing. And admittedly, the characters in Dissidia like really want me to really make me want to try those respective games. With Shantoto representing Final Fantasy 11 in a great way, and Ishtola from Final Fantasy 14 being the representative in the Dissidia franchise as well. But if we're talking about the soundtracks, my experiences with them are absolutely lovely. So that's kind of like the intro to this respective pairing questions. First, the Final Fantasy question. Pick up to 3 of either your favorite songs or favorite albums from the Final Fantasy franchise. Feel free to do both if you want to. It's hard to choose. I get it. I seriously get it. But that's the prompt for the Final Fantasy question. And for a book-related question, pick a book that you either liked or loved. Choose up to 3 songs that you feel have a good connection to that work. If your book has a movie, TV, or game adaptation, you're welcome to choose songs from the soundtrack that struck you, up to 3 songs. So my answers for these respective questions, first for the Final Fantasy question, pick up to 3 of either your favorite songs or favorite albums from the Final Fantasy franchise. I'm going to choose 3 songs. So I had a very hard time picking 3 songs for this question because the Final Fantasy franchise has such lovely soundtracks overall in terms of things, and even lovely individual tracks. But I told myself that I was going to pick 3 specific songs for this question. First one that came to my mind was "You Are Not Alone" from Final Fantasy IX. This song plays during a very pivotal scene in the game where Zidane questions his identity. I can't go into too much more detail than that because it involves heavy spoilers for the game, especially like towards the latter part of the game. But I will say that the composition for this track is so well done and has been among my favorites for years. The second track that I'll name is "Land of Icons" from Final Fantasy XVI, and this is a very recent favorite. This is the track that plays on the title screen, and I mentioned this probably in my non-spoiler review of Final Fantasy XVI. I adored that track from the first time that I heard it. It just, like, it kind of just grabs hold of you and does not let go. I was so happy for a brief moment, very brief time, when the collective album for Final Fantasy XVI soundtrack went to #1 on iTunes in terms of things. You could could tell that so many people were waiting for that soundtrack to drop when the game was released. Be like, where is it? I need the soundtrack right now. It is so good. But I'm glad that I was able to pick it up and buy it for myself and listen to all the tracks to it. But Land of Icons definitely has a place in my heart, and I love it so, so much. And then for the last pick for a track, Final Fantasy song that really stuck with me, I'm going to pick a vocal track for this pick. And I had so many different choices to for vocal tracks that I could have named through the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. This was hard, and originally I was going to choose Calling for Rain, which is from Final Fantasy 15, but it's technically from the Kingsglaive movie, so you can experience the track in game when you play Final Fantasy 15 as you're riding with the boys in their vehicle in terms of things that they're going from different place to place. But since that's not a mainline track for that particular game, I decided to choose something else in terms of things. So what I will say for mainstay themes, let's do Kiss Me Goodbye by Angela Aki from Final Fantasy XII. That is just a wonderful vocal track that fits the game very, very well. Her vocals stuck with me for so many years on that song in both English and Japanese. And I remember playing it for weeks and had chills up even listening to it apart from its context within the game. Love Angela Aki as an artist in general in terms of things. She's one of my favorite Japanese artists, and I love her music so, so much. I even loved her covers of Faye Wong's Eyes on Me, which comes from the Final Fantasy VIII soundtrack. I love that song too, and I love Faye Wong, but her cover of it is also really, really good. And I loved Angela Aki's cover of Kiss from a Rose, which was originally done by Seal, which I'm kind of biased because that Seal song is one of my favorites as well. But yeah, in general, I would say for the vocal track, Kiss Me Goodbye is a lovely tune, fits the game very well, and I've enjoyed it for so many years. For the second answer to this question, for this respective question, which is pick a book that you liked or loved. Choose up to 3 songs that you feel have a good connection to that work. If your book has a movie, TV, or game adaptation, you're welcome to choose songs from the soundtrack that struck you, up to 3 songs. So I'm only going to name 1 song, and this is technically cheating a bit because this is based on a film adaptation of a popular book series. And I'm selecting from the soundtrack. Mockingjay was not my favorite book in the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins, but I appreciated it overall for what it attempted to do. The movies I felt were on point for what they offered as well. But the song Scream My Name by Tuvlo remains one of the strongest songs in my mind that came from the soundtrack of those movies because I feel like it fits Katniss to a T in terms of the theme and the resonance and the instrumentation and everything else. Just Tuvlo did a wonderful job on that song, I feel like. And I still love it to this respective day. Now we come to the last set of questions in this respective Final Fantasy Legacy tag. This is question number 8, Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 16, definition of a guardian. And so for Final Fantasy 15 and 16, they both boast some really excellent examples of characters defining themselves on their own terms. In Final Fantasy 15, we follow Prince Noctis alongside his protectors and best friends, Prompto, Gladio, and Ignis, as they journey to take back the kingdom from the oppressive reign of the Empire. And there are countless quests that Noctis takes alongside his friends, like brothers, that provide examples of the bonds that he shares with them. These journeys also provide a definition for his character in terms of his willingness to help the people in the kingdom in the midst of many traumatic events that he endures over the course of the game. And Final Fantasy 16 is somewhat similar in terms of this pairing because it primarily follows the path of Clive Rosfield as he struggles in the aftermath of events at Phoenix Gate. His trauma shapes his journey of revenge and ultimately shaping of his character through the many people he meets along his journey. His journey really has more weight to the fate of the world than he knows to start with in the respective journey of the game. But Clive's determination and heart really come through in his quest for truth and to protect those that he cares about. Another thing that's interesting about these games is how it defines what it means to have power and wield them in a way that provides protection for a cause or a group of people. In many cases across the Final Fantasy franchise, we see these beyond belief forces through icons, Eidolons, guardian forces, or simply put, summons. And sometimes these protectors may not be characters who can wield magic at all, but they may simply be people with talents that allow them to craft things or have unique abilities that can be used to protect. So that lends to my final question in this Final Fantasy tag. And you can probably guess where this is going. So for the Final Fantasy question, who are your favorite summons or people beings who serve as protectors in some way in the Final Fantasy franchise? Name up to 3 if you choose. And then for the book-related question, name a favorite character who serves as a guardian or protector in a favorite book or series of yours. Why are they your favorite? Bonus points if it's a fantasy or a fantasy romance. So I'm going to start with the Final Fantasy question first. My favorite summons are easy for me to name. I have been with this franchise for years, so and you'll probably see why I make mention of these particular summons. So first, I will say Shiva is one of my favorites in every iteration of the Final Fantasy series as a summon. I love this Queen of Ice. She is absolutely breathtaking in more ways than one, and I use her in battle for quite a bit of things up through the different points of different games I played with her in. And if I had to name the versions of her that are my favorite, I would say probably Shiva's version in Final Fantasy X, as well as Final Fantasy 16 are my favorite representations of the character. And then another summon that I love following as well is Ifrit, who is the god of fire, who represents fire in terms of things, and every iteration of the Final Fantasy franchise as well. I love watching him show up. He's powerful, and usually I feel like Ifrit and Shiva show up really early on in several Final Fantasy games, so I think that's one of the reasons I have a fondness for both of them in terms of things. And if I were to say some of my favorite representations of Ifrit in the Final Fantasy franchise, it would be his representation in Final Fantasy VIII as well as Final Fantasy X. And I can put those up for your reference to just kind of show off the character a little bit. Yeah, and then for my last representation, I'm going to go with a protector character in the collective franchise of Final Fantasy of the Final Fantasy franchise. I would say I want to choose a protector character that's human. Yeah, like in terms of representation, I'm gonna go with Auron from Final Fantasy X. Yeah, considering the role that he plays, he's an excellent protector and guide, especially for Tidus and the other characters in that respective game. Though his, without going into spoilers, watching his character arc hurt. It hurt a lot. And he's very easy on the eyes too. I'll say that. If you answered him as your character crush in one of the previous questions, I totally get it. I totally get it. And also, if you chose Yuna as both your choice for a character crush and protector character, that is also another choice that I completely understand as well. But yeah, I may do a tier ranking of some of my favorite Final Fantasy characters overall later on when I'm making content for the channel, but I think it would require me to replay some of the Final Fantasy games to kind of refresh my memory on certain things. But we can put a pin in it and think about it for future videos for the channel. And then for the final question, which is book related, name a favorite character who serves as a guardian or protector in a favorite book or series of yours. Why are they your favorite? Bonus points for fantasy or fantasy romance. So I feel like this is a difficult question because I think of all the books that I have potentially read, and there's so many characters that I could name, but I'm drawing a blank. So I feel like romantic suspense books, romantic sci-fi, fantasy, suspense books are my bread and butter. But yeah, one of the first characters I thought of was even though this isn't a character from a sci-fi or fantasy book series, I was thinking of Shane from Agnes and the Hitman. He's a very funny character, very interesting, like characterization for a hitman who attempts to protect Agnes in every way he can from all these different monsters and people who have a hit on his head. But like, since that is not fantasy or sci-fi, I'm gonna defer on that. Though, if you want to choose him as a character, I completely understand. Oh, you know what? I just thought of it. Okay, so Darkest London by Kristen Callahan is one of my favorite fantasy romance series. And I could name several heroes and heroines alike who serve as great protectors from that series. I'm gonna probably go with Jack Talent and Mary Chase from Shadow Dance for my answer for this choice. I think the chemistry between Jack and Mary from that story is one of my favorites. And the way that they each stepped up to the plate for fight each other in pursuit of a ruthless serial killer in that book was very, very well done. Like, the world building in the Darkest London series is very well done, but for that particular book, in terms of stuff that their characterization, considering everything that they've gone through, especially even Jack's role and what he went through in previous books of this series, is just like heartbreaking to watch. But the way that Shadow Dance portrayed both of their characters and their respective journeys was very well done, in my opinion. And I'll go with Jack and Mary, both from Shadow Dance by Kristen Callahan. And though I could easily name any of the characters from the Darkest London series, which I would definitely recommend. So that is it for my respective Final Fantasy Legacy book tag. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, kudos to you, and I would love for anyone to pick up this tag if you're interested in doing it, whether you do the Final Fantasy questions or the bookish questions, or even both of them. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be informed of when I post new videos. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope that this served to be a fitting tribute to one of my favorite franchises, as well as my favorite hobbies. Thank you again. Hope you have a wonderful day. I'll see you next video.